They mocked my baby over dinner, so I gave them a document that shut them up forever. My name is Hannah. I'm in my mid-30s, and I've been a single mom since the day my daughter was born. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My daughter's name is Clara. She's 2 years old, the light of my life, the reason I get up every morning even when things feel impossible. Her father, Mark, wasn't there for me when I needed him most. When I was pregnant, he walked out. He said he wasn't ready, that it wasn't his problem, and that maybe Clara wasn't even his child. Those words burned into me, but I decided then and there that I would raise her with or without him. And I did. For 2 years, it's just been me and Clara, figuring out life together, learning how to stretch every dollar, and filling our little apartment with laughter. I hadn't spoken to Mark's family in all that time. His mother, Janet, and his sister, Emily, never called, never checked in. I assumed they didn't care, and honestly, I was fine with that. But then, out of the blue, Janet called me. She said the family wanted to finally meet Clara and invited us to dinner. At first, I didn't know how to respond. My gut told me to say no. Why should I open the door to people who had ignored us when things were hardest? But then I looked at Clara, her big brown eyes staring up at me, and I thought maybe it would be good for her. Maybe she deserved the chance to know her father's side of the family. Maybe, just maybe, they were ready to accept her. So I said yes. The week leading up to the dinner, I was a mess of nerves. I wanted everything to be perfect for Clara. I bought her a new little dress with tiny flowers on it. I brushed her hair until it shone and packed her favorite toy so she would feel safe if things got overwhelming. The day of the dinner, as we walked up the steps to Janet's house, my heart was pounding. I told myself this could be a fresh start. I tried to believe it. When Janet opened the door, her smile was thin, her eyes cold, but she said, "Come in." Emily barely glanced at Clara before walking back into the dining room. Still, I told myself to stay positive. We sat down at the table, the smell of roast chicken filling the room. The conversation started off stiff, full of fake politeness. I kept waiting for warmth, some sign that they wanted us there. Clara sat beside me, swinging her little legs, humming to herself. I reached for her hand under the table and thought, maybe tonight will surprise me. But deep down, I already felt a storm coming. The day of the dinner arrived, and I felt nerves twisting in my stomach from the moment I woke up. Clara toddled around the apartment, giggling as I tried to get us both ready. I wanted her to look her best, to walk into that house and show them exactly who she was, sweet, bright, and full of life. I had gone out the night before and found her a little dress with pale yellow flowers stitched along the hem. When I slipped it over her head, she clapped her hands and spun in a tiny circle, proud of herself. I told her she looked beautiful, and she gave me the kind of smile that makes every struggle worth it. As I packed a small bag with snacks, wipes, and her favorite stuffed bunny, I caught myself staring out the window, lost in thought. I tried to imagine what this evening might bring. A part of me longed for kindness, even a sliver of understanding. I wanted so badly to believe that maybe these people could look at Clara and see what I saw every day: love, innocence, and a child who deserved family. The hope was fragile, but I held on to it tightly. When we finally pulled up in front of the house, my chest felt heavy. Clara squeezed my hand as we walked to the door. The porch light glowed above us, and I forced myself to take a deep breath before knocking. The door swung open, and there stood Janet. Her eyes scanned me first, then slid down to Clara. Her lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, come in," she said, her tone clipped, as if this visit was nothing more than an obligation. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and roasted meat. Emily was already seated at the dining table. She glanced at Clara for half a second, her expression unreadable, then turned her attention back to her phone without a word. Clara, oblivious, clutched her bunny to her chest and looked up at me. I gave her hand a small squeeze, silently telling her it was okay. We were led to the table, where place settings gleamed under the soft light of a chandelier. Janet fussed with the napkins, as though we were already doing something wrong, just by sitting there. The conversation started with the usual small talk, comments about the weather, work, and traffic. On the surface, it sounded polite, but every word felt like it was spoken through gritted teeth. I could sense the distance in the way they looked at me, the way their eyes skimmed past Clara, as though she were barely there. Still, I straightened in my chair and kept my voice calm, determined not to let their coldness push me away. I told myself that I was here for Clara. Whatever they thought of me didn't matter. All that mattered was giving my daughter the chance to know where she came from, even if the welcome wasn't what I had hoped. No sooner had we settled into our seats than the atmosphere began to shift. At first it was the pauses between words, the way eyes darted across the table and then back to their plates. But soon the comments started slipping through. Emily glanced at Clara, tilted her head, and with a faint smirk said, "She doesn't really look like a Mitchell, does she?" Her voice was light, almost playful, but the meaning behind it was sharp enough to cut. The words hung in the air. Clara was busy patting her bunny against the table, completely unaware of the insult, and for that I was grateful. I forced a small smile, the kind you give when you know no reply will satisfy the person trying to provoke you. My jaw tightened, but I didn't let it show. Janet picked up where Emily left off, her tone slow and deliberate. "What do you usually feed her, Hannah? She looks, well, a little small for her age. Maybe you're not giving her the right foods." She didn't wait for an answer before adding, "And that dress, too thin for this time of year, don't you think? Poor thing will catch a cold." I swallowed, nodded politely, and took a sip of water. My hand stayed steady, even though my stomach twisted. She wasn't finished. Leaning forward, she looked directly at Clara, and then back at me. "Does she even speak clearly yet? At her age, children should be saying whole sentences. Maybe you're not working with her. You know, it's important to put in the effort early, or they fall behind." Each remark was like a pinprick, tiny but relentless. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but outwardly I kept my expression calm, pleasant, almost detached. My lips curved into a smile that I didn't feel, one meant to signal that I wasn't rattled, even though the truth was the opposite. Clara tugged at my sleeve, asking softly for a piece of bread. I gave it to her, smoothing her hair, pretending not to notice the way Emily and Janet exchanged quick glances. The conversation moved on to something trivial, weather, errands, recipes, but their earlier words stayed lodged in my mind. I wanted to stand up, to call them out, to demand why they thought it was acceptable to sit there and pick apart every choice I'd made for my daughter. But I knew that would only feed their satisfaction. So I kept my smile steady, my voice even, and tucked all that anger deep inside. This wasn't about me. It was about protecting Clara from the poison that dripped so casually from their mouth. I sat there with a calm face while inside I counted every sting, every barb, every disguised insult they threw my way. The shift from subtle comments to outright cruelty happened faster than I could brace for. Emily leaned toward Clara, pointing at the bread in her tiny hand. "What color is that?" she asked in a sing-song voice. Clara blinked up at her shyly and stayed quiet, her cheeks puffing as she chewed. Emily gave a high, mocking laugh. "Oh wow, she doesn't even know? That's kind of slow for her age, isn't it?" Her eyes flicked toward me, daring me to react. My throat tightened, but before I could respond, another sound cut through the room. Mark, who had sat mostly silent up until that moment, let out a low chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and with a smirk said, "Well, guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The words were tossed so casually, as though he hadn't just reduced his own daughter to a punchline. For a moment I hoped the remark would land wrong, that someone else at the table would shut it down. Instead, it sparked something uglier. Emily's laughter grew louder. Janet shook her head with a twisted smile, and even one of Mark's cousins snorted, as if the whole exchange was entertainment. The sound of it surrounded me, sharp and echoing, impossible to block out. Clara, still clutching her bunny, looked around in confusion. She didn't understand their words, but she felt their laughter, and her little hand reached for mine under the table. I gripped it tightly, willing her to feel safe through my touch, even as every fiber of me screamed inside. I sat frozen, my body stiff, my mind torn between rage and disbelief. These were adults, family no less, aiming their cruelty at a child who hadn't done a single thing wrong. My daughter, my baby, being mocked like she was nothing more than the butt of a family joke. Their laughter rang on, each chuckle striking like another blow. And as I looked at Clara's wide, uncomprehending eyes, something in me cracked. My heart felt as though it had splintered into pieces, watching grown people, people who should have been protectors, take delight in tearing down someone so innocent. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I didn't even let my face change. Instead, I sat there in silence, lifting a spoonful of food to my mouth as if nothing had been said. With my other arm, I pulled Clara closer, letting her rest against me. Her small head leaned against my shoulder, and I stroked her hair gently, making sure she felt protected even in the middle of that poisonous table. On the surface, I looked calm, detached, as though their laughter had slipped past me. But inside, it was another story entirely. Rage burned hot and steady in my chest, spreading through every vein. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my teeth pressing hard together, every muscle in my body screaming to lash out. Yet I forced it all down, locking it tight. They didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me break. As I chewed, I kept my eyes low, my mind drifting to a memory I had kept buried for 2 years. A memory attached to a single sheet of paper folded away in an envelope. That document had sat untouched in my drawer since the day Clara was born, though its contents were etched into my mind word for word. When Clara arrived, Mark had been nowhere in sight. He hadn't just left me, he had thrown his final words like knives, insisting she wasn't his. He said it with certainty, as though denial would erase responsibility. But I hadn't let it end there. I had taken the steps, gone through the process, made sure the truth was carved into something no one could argue with. The paternity test had sealed it beyond doubt. For 2 years, I had carried that truth quietly. I never mailed it to him, never stormed into his life with, never shoved it in the faces of the people who had turned their backs on us. I thought maybe it wasn't worth the fight, that protecting Clara's peace mattered more than proving a point. But sitting at that table, listening to their ridicule, watching them treat her like she was less than human, I felt the envelope call to me from the bottom of my purse. I kept feeding Clara small bites, smiling at her between each one, making sure my mask never slipped. But behind the smile, my mind was already made up. If they wanted to mock my daughter, if they wanted to reduce her to a joke, then it was time they stared the truth in the face. They thought they could laugh at her without consequence. What they didn't know was that I had been carrying the very thing that could silence every cruel word in an instant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just sat in that chair, outwardly composed, while inside I held on to the fury and the power that was about to change everything. Their voices buzzed around me, sharp and unrelenting, each laugh another jab meant to cut deeper. I let the noise wash over, my hand steady on Clara's back, until I decided I had heard enough. Without a word, I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped lightly against the floor, and for the first time all evening, their laughter faltered. "I'll be right back," I said evenly, my tone calm, almost too calm. I rose from the table, walked to the sideboard where I'd left my bag, and unzipped it with deliberate care. My fingers found the thick envelope resting at the bottom, edges worn from being carried around though never used. I pulled it free, holding it flat against my palm, and turned back toward the table. They watched me with curiosity, some with faint smirks as though expecting me to produce baby pictures or a snack for Clara. Instead, I returned to my seat and placed the envelope in the center of the table, my movements precise, controlled. "Since you all have so much to say about my daughter," I said, my voice steady, each word measured, "maybe you should read this first." Silence fell immediately. No one reached for food, no one chuckled. Even Clara sensed the change, her big eyes following the envelope as though it carried weight far beyond paper. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his hand twitching against the tablecloth. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with visible reluctance, he dragged the envelope toward him and slid a finger under the seal. The flap opened with a soft tear that seemed to echo in the hushed room. He unfolded the document slowly, eyes scanning the line. I watched as his expression shifted, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally something heavier, paler. His skin drained of color, lips pressed tight, shoulders stiff. He held the page as though it had burned him. No one else dared speak. All eyes were fixed on Mark, waiting for him to reveal what he saw written there. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, and for once, the man who had always carried himself with careless arrogance looked stripped of every ounce of power. Janet's hand shot out before Mark could fold the sheet back up. She tugged it from his grip with a sharp snap of paper, her eyes narrowing as they skimmed the line. The room was still, so quiet I could hear Clara humming softly to herself beside me. Janet's lips moved as she read, and then her voice cut through the air, brittle and clipped. 99.9% probability. Mark Mitchell is the biological father of Clara. The words rang like a bell in the dining room. For a moment, nobody breathed. The clinking of cutlery, the laughter, the smug remarks, all of it vanished in an instant. What had been noise and mockery dissolved into a thick, choking silence. Emily's eyes darted from her mother to Mark, her face draining of its usual confidence. She sat frozen, stunned, as though the weight of what had just been spoken aloud had pinned her to her chair. Janet's jaw tightened, her mouth a thin line, fury simmering beneath the surface at being forced to confront something she had tried so hard to dismiss. Mark didn't move. He sat rigid, staring at the table as if the words on that page had carved a hollow inside him. For the first time that night, there was no smirk, no deflection, no arrogance to hide behind. I let the silence stretch until it grew unbearable. Then I spoke, my tone calm but steady, cutting through the stillness. "So next time you want to insult a child," I said, my eyes sweeping across each of them, "remember you're insulting your own blood." The words landed heavy. No one dared reply. The truth lay there between us, undeniable, and all the laughter that had filled the room only moments ago was gone, leaving nothing but the sound of Clara's small hands tapping lightly against the table. Janet was the first to break the silence. Her face was tight, her voice pitched higher than before as she forced out a laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. "Oh, come on now," she said quickly, waving her hand toward the crumpled paper on the table. "It was just a joke. No one meant anything by it. You're being far too sensitive." Her words tumbled over each other, desperate, as if she could smooth everything back into the fake politeness that had covered the evening earlier. Emily kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Her cheeks flushed pink, and she shifted in her seat, fiddling with her. The bravado that had been in her voice before was gone. She didn't offer an apology, but her silence spoke louder than anything else. Mark, however, couldn't stay quiet. His face was pale but blotched red at the edges, his chest heaving as though the air itself had betrayed him. "You didn't have to do this here," he snapped, his voice rough. "Dragging out some piece of paper like you're putting on a show, making a scene in front of everyone. You think this proves something? All it proves is that you'll do anything to embarrass me." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I slid my chair back and stood. Clara's bunny sat on the seat beside her, and I tucked it into her small hand. Then I gathered her bag, slipped her jacket around her shoulders, and adjusted the strap across mine. Each movement was careful, deliberate, as though their anger and excuses were nothing more than background noise. When I had everything in place, I turned back to face them. My voice was calm, even though every word was edged with truth. "I came here hoping Clara would find family," I said. "Instead, she found bullies. But she won't ever need people like you." The words lingered in the room, sharp and final. No one tried to stop me as I took Clara's hand and guided her toward the door. A few days passed, and the quiet that followed the dinner was almost startling. Then word reached me through a friend who still kept loose ties with the Mitchells. She told me the evening hadn't been forgotten. It had exploded into arguments that carried on long after Clara and I walked out. Inside that house, the document had left a scar. Janet, furious that the truth had been dragged out in front of her, turned her anger on Mark. She accused him of bringing shame, of letting things get out of control, of being the reason the family's name was now whispered with embarrassment. Her bitterness spread through every conversation, tearing at the image she worked so hard to maintain. Emily, who had been so quick with her smirks and sly comments, no longer had anything to say. My friend mentioned she had avoided the subject altogether, ducking out of rooms whenever it came up, unwilling to be caught in the storm. For someone who always carried herself with confidence, her silence was telling. Mark, though, couldn't leave it alone. A few nights later, my phone lit up with his name. The message he sent was clumsy, an awkward attempt to reach out. He wrote as if a single text could undo years of absence and a dinner full of cruelty. I read it once, felt the hollowness in his words, and set the phone aside without answering. I hadn't fought for his presence before, and I wasn't about to now. What surprised me most wasn't their anger or their avoidance. It was the feeling that settled over me afterward. A kind of peace, unfamiliar but steady. I realized I didn't need them, not their validation, not their approval, not their version of family. The weight I'd carried, the hope that maybe they could give Clara something I couldn't, had lifted. All that mattered was already with me. My daughter's laughter, her small hand in mine, the life we built together without them. When the dust finally settled, I found myself replaying that night in my mind. The sharp words, the laughter that had cut so deep, the way they circled around my little girl as though she were fair game. It all could have broken me if I'd let it. But instead, it had turned into something else entirely. They had thought they could wound us with their mockery, but what they never saw coming was how quickly the truth could strip them bare. I remembered the look on their faces when the paper hit the table, how quickly every chuckle died, how the room collapsed into silence heavier than any insult. No shouting on my part, no theatrics, no screaming match had been needed. Just one document, one undeniable fact, and suddenly all their power was gone. That silence was louder than anything I could have shouted back at them. The beauty of it was in its simplicity. I hadn't needed to fight them. I hadn't needed to lower myself to their level. They mocked an innocent baby, and in return, the truth humiliated them more than any words ever could. That was my justice, sharp and clean, delivered without rage. Back in our small apartment, Clara played on the floor with her blocks, babbling happily, untouched by their cruelty. She stacked the pieces with both hands, then clapped for herself when they toppled over. Watching her, I knew she had no idea what had been said at that table, no awareness of the venom that had been directed her way. And that was my greatest comfort. She remained pure joy, untouched, unscarred. I didn't need their acceptance. I didn't need their recognition. All I needed was right there with me, every day, laughing, growing, filling my world with light no one could dim. Revenge doesn't always come from anger. Sometimes it comes from truth. And the truth shut them up for good. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away from them, or should I have given them another chance? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories.